Thanks, folks, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here. So, just to one little thing that Brent said at the end, you know, on free votes, and you weren't in the House yesterday, and there was a private member's bill vote on e-petitions, and it passed because 8 or 10 Conservative MPs voted for it. It was an NDP, I think, an NDP motion. So we do allow way more free votes than the NDP, and you know, Brent acknowledged that. I put together some folks, some notes, mainly I think to maybe just provoke some thought and some questions. But if you substitute Canada for America, Thomas Jefferson was right when he said, "We in America, read Canada, do not have government by the majority. We have government by the majority who participate." And clearly that's you folks. So thank you for participating, because as Pericles said, just because you don't take an interest in politics doesn't mean politics is not going to take an interest in you, and I think everybody in this room knows that. And as Plato concluded, I sound like James Rajat here quoting Plato and Pericles. But as he concluded, one of the penalties of refusing to participate in politics is that you end up being governed by your inferiors. Which is why I guess all the people who know how to run the country are driving cabs, tending bar, and cutting hair. Sorry, that's another story. But I'm not here to quote dead Greeks and Americans. Allow me to quote a dead Canadian. "I just think you Westerners should take over this country if you're so smart." Well, Pierre, last name need not be said, we have. And William F. Buckley summed up the Liberals when he said that Liberals claim to want to give a hearing to other views, but then are shocked and offended to discover that there actually are other views beyond their own. Anyway, thanks for the opportunity to be here. As I said, I'll try to give you a couple of bits of food for thought. I was asked to take the theme, is our democracy broken? No, it is not. And I suggest it is not. It may need tweaking. It may be a work in progress, like every organization is, like every institution, certainly as large as a national government is, or a national political process is. There will always be things we can and should do to keep it relevant and keep it current. But it's not broken, as some would suggest. It is evolving. And how many were here this morning when Michelle Rempel spoke? Okay, a number. And we didn't collaborate on this, and I'm not going to say the same things, but it's going to be kind of the same theme. And one of her big messages was, it's up to us, in this room, and people we know, it's up to us to make sure that it's not broken, that it stays not broken, that it evolves in a logical and relevant way. And a famous Churchill quote that I like is that, democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. Now, Churchill said that on November 11th, 1947, shortly after he'd been defeated. So he may have been a little bit bitter at that point. But on that day he also said, they have a perfect right to kick me out, that is democracy. And he's right. And just because democracy doesn't work for anyone on their particular terms on any particular issue, doesn't mean it's broken. Michelle talked this morning about positive dissent. We need dissent. Absolutely we need dissent. We need dissent between parties so we can give voters a choice to differentiate between left, right, center, whatever. We need dissent within parties. I mean, to think that all conservatives think the same is absurd, or liberals or NDP or whoever. It just doesn't make sense. We need dissent. It needs to be positive dissent. It needs to be constructive dissent. It needs to lead to something that may make a change. Or even if it doesn't lead to a change, at least we've had an airing and a rational discussion. And I'll probably say it again, but that's one of the things that I find missing in Canadian politics and Canadian society in general. We're not allowed to discuss, it seems. We're not allowed to discuss difficult issues, and that drives me nuts. We should be able to discuss it, and rationally, without calling each other names and all that kind of stuff. That seems to be difficult to do for Canadians. So I'm going to talk a little bit about comparative politics. And there's a book published by W.W. Norton and Company called The Essentials of Comparative Politics. Whoever W.W. Norton and Company are, but they wrote published some stuff that looked good. And they talked about advanced democracies, and I think probably most people here would agree that Canada is an advanced democracy. There are countries with institutional democracy, which is really what we're talking about today, and a high level of development and prosperity, and that certainly is Canada. As a category, advanced democracies include not just Western countries, Canada, US, Britain, and so on, but also more recent democratizers and post-communist countries that have exhibited the hallmarks of economic development and democracy. And that would include countries like Poland and Hungary and the Czech Republic and the Baltic states. It used to, but no longer includes Ukraine, and that's obviously a work in progress, which is definitely a broken democracy. You want a broken democracy? There's one. And the early attempts in Syria, Egypt, and Libya aren't going so well. So when we say Canada's democracy is broken, or those that contend that it is, you know, we need to do a bit of comparison here with other democracies. All things aside and all personal issues aside, we're in pretty darn good shape. But we need to keep it that way. According to Freedom House, there's 121 electoral democracies now out of what, 190 nation states and 18 territories. Of course, just because they have what are called democratic elections does not necessarily make them an advanced democracy, and does not necessarily make those elections, you know, fully democratic. You know, having spent some time in Afghanistan, I've seen that, and you know, Iraq and various other countries around the world. But all advanced democracies share basic components of liberal democracies, and that's a commitment to private property, free markets, a belief in liberty, political competition, and participation. These advanced democracies also differ significantly in a variety of areas. For instance, how they balance freedom and equality. The level of their political participation, which frankly in Canada, I think we'd all agree, is much lower than it should be. In the form of political competition, i.e. campaigns. You know, should it be first past the post, should it be PR, should it be some combination thereof. And although they're changing significantly, the institutions present in advanced democracies are part of what makes countries modern. And that's secular, technological, bureaucratic, bureaucrats, rational, materialistic, and placing a greater emphasis on individual freedom than on collective equality. And there's always a balance there as to what should take precedence. And we can debate about where Canada sits on the scale of any one of those attributes, but I think the sum of those things does describe what Canada is, and thankfully so. Although advanced democracies all display a relatively high level of sovereignty, there's been movement towards more integration or blurring of lines between countries by creating common policies, rules, tighter connections, and devolution, or the shifting of power towards more local governments. A prime example of integration is obviously the European Union. And having spent, I was in Strasbourg at the Council of Europe, 47 countries, including the 28 members of the European Union, and it was pretty interesting how they tried, and they just succeeded to an extent to have common approaches and so on. But again, there's dissent, and some of that is very historic and very bitter and so on. But it's healthy, and it's by and large productive. A less obvious example of integration would be the harmonizing of many of the North American institutions between Canada and the United States, such as the TD, Toronto Dominion, becoming, if you've been down there, they've got big signs saying America's local bank. I'm not sure that Americans know what TD stands for. Another would be the harmonization of many of our defense and security arrangements, such as NORAD, various cross-border cooperation measures that we have, the kinds of things that drive people like Maud Barlow crazy. And if we can drive Maud Barlow crazy, well, I shouldn't say that. But I'm for that. Does that make Canada's democracy weaker because we've got closer ties with the U.S. and we've got closer integration and coordination? I don't think so. In fact, it may sharpen our senses to ensure that while we do enjoy a favored relationship overall with the United States, with our American partners, Keystone XL aside, we are careful to differentiate ourselves in our Canadianism. A recent example of devolution of power in Canada is the agreement between Canada and the Northwest Territories to devolve more powers and direct control to the government in Yellowknife. And that's a step forward. I think eventually there'll be a lot of things to happen yet, but to eventually take the territories to provincial status. A second challenge to traditional state sovereignty has been the tug of devolution from below. And many political leaders in advanced democracies are concerned about public distrust of state power. We see that in Canada, and advocate devolution to bring government closer to the public. And as with integration, there's critics of increasing devolution, as it may contend to polarize the society or undermine the capacity and autonomy of the central state. And we can all argue about how much autonomy the central state should have. That's a fair conversation. In the current Canadian federal political context, such a tug from below may in fact be the Reform Act. What we've been talking about a lot today, I'm sure, not having been here. The question is, who is tugging on whom? Do they have a clear view of where they want to go or might wind up? I'll talk about the Senate in a minute. When you talk about the elected Senate, great idea. Have we thought it all the way through as to all the implications of that? Democracies share a number of things. They share governments based on the decisions of the majority, either directly or indirectly. And the people in government are connected both through the process, how decisions are made, elections, laws, and so on, and the outcome, what decisions are made. Pericles had a few ideas, back to the Greeks, about the characteristics of democracy, and that was rule by the people, equality under law, pluralism, i.e. respect for diverse viewpoints, the idea of private domain, private property, and a high enough standard of living to secure people's happiness. You know, if you go to countries, you know, some of the poorer countries in the world, the folks aren't very happy. And the governments don't tend to be very stable because they are PO'd that they don't have what they know they should have. We're not, I mean, we're Canadians, so we like to complain about things. That's just who we are. But man, oh man, for anybody, and I know many of you have, who've gone to other places around the world, we've got it pretty darn good. So people in government are connected through free and fair elections, through access to government officials, and I think again in Canada we've got a pretty good record of that, through the types of policies enacted, some popular, some not so popular. So democracy means two things. It means procedures, how we get to where we're going, and substance. You know, what decisions we're making and what it leads to. So there's 5 dimensions I want to examine quickly. One is participation, how people select their government officials and express policy preferences. And we've talked about things like recall and all that kind of stuff. But basically, who is franchised? Who votes? In Canada, you know, we've evolved through a number of stages that, you know, obviously anybody 18 years of age or older who is a citizen. Sometimes people who are 18 years of age and older who aren't citizens, but that's another issue. And, you know, what issues are subject to popular vote? And that comes back to some of the things perhaps in the Reform Act. You know, who should be calling the shots on who hires or fires a party leader, potentially a prime minister? You know, the low turnout of the electorate complicates their ability to claim strong participation. The highest turnout in any Canadian election in history was 1958 at 79.4%, and made a great decision because they elected a majority government with John Diefenbaker. The lowest turnout was in 2008 at 58.8%, which is pretty pathetic. So is that a threat to democracy? Maybe. I think it quite possibly is, and I refer back to Thomas Jefferson at the beginning when he said, you know, we in America, we in Canada, do not have government by the majority, we have government by the majority who participate. And that's where we all come in. Side issue, you know, voting incentive in Australia, they have, you're fined if you don't vote. I'd like to see some kind of a incentive in Canada to vote, but not a negative incentive. And I haven't costed this out, I just throw it out. Maybe a small tax credit for voting. It might pull some more folks to the polls in a positive way, not a negative way. The second element is pluralism. How does the government advance tolerance for different ideas? The democracies are composed of people of diverse viewpoints and backgrounds, and that's what makes democracy strong. That's what makes this room strong. And how are they accommodated? How are their interests represented? You know, we talk about media in this country, and just, I won't go into detail, but you know, the last couple of days with Veterans Affairs issues, and I know them deeply. How they've been represented by the media is you know, there's some understandable situations that need addressing, but how the media have represented it is not the way it happened. I was there. What they're saying happened didn't happen. So that, you know, becomes a problem or a challenge, I guess, in a society like ours. Religious toleration. Obviously, the Charter guarantees religious freedom to permit diverse religious views to coexist in a democratic framework. Can that be problematic down the road? You know, potentially. Something called, this really big word that only Michelle Rempel would normally be allowed to say, and that's developmentalism. How does the government ensure people can develop to their full potential? You know, it's about political socialization, the project or the process by which citizens learn basic political values and beliefs, which enables them to act in the political system. Now, we've all grown up, I assume everybody is here today because they are politically active, politically concerned, probably grew up that way for most of you, you know, in your parents' homes. You know, the sources of that socialization are obviously family, friends, political leaders, schools, interest groups, that sort of thing. And a lot of people, you know, that I've talked to, and I know Brent's talked to many as well, they will say, I vote, fill in the blank, because that's the way my parents voted. Is that the best reason to vote, fill in the blank? No, it isn't, but, you know, that's the way it is. So we have an important role, and, you know, if you believe in conservatism, and I suspect you mostly here do, then it's our role to promote that amongst our family and friends and kids and so on. Now that doesn't mean the democracy is broken at all. If that were so, you know, people voting the way their parents voted, et cetera, et cetera, if that were so, then the democracy has been broken for, you know, 150 years. So that's not a measure. You know, there's an old saying that if you're not liberal at 20, you have no heart. If you're not conservative at 40, you have no brain. And I think that still pertains. The fourth element is protection. How does the government ensure democratic values are protected? And how does it balance the need for liberty with counter pressures for order and security? You know, whose notion? Everybody has a different notion of balance. You know, does security trump liberty? You know, you might get a different answer. You will get a different answer in the United States. You will get here for reasons of experiences they've had and that we haven't had, certainly to the same extent. So it's always going to be comparative. You know, challenges for democracy. You know, democracy can never guarantee, or sorry, can never provide absolute protection from government control, because even in Canada, no rights are absolute, and that's spelled out in the Charter. No right is absolute. If there is a reason that that right can be suspended or modified or tempered, then that is possible in any democracy. You know, wartime fears drive majorities to pass laws that restrict or even criminalize unpopular minorities. And we've had lots of experiences in Canada with that. The Italians, Japanese, Ukrainians, Austro-Hungarians at various times in our history. And the last one is performance. How well does the government serve its citizens' material needs? Because that's what most folks are looking at. What are you doing for me? And we can compare democracy in terms of socioeconomic factors, but despite our complaining, and as mentioned before, you know, after all, in Canada, we are pretty darn well off. Is our democracy broken? No. Is our democracy messy? Absolutely. It is. And it probably always will be. Just like every other democracy. Probably, I don't know, maybe lots of messy democracies around the world. The Prime Minister was just in Israel. Israel has a pretty messy democracy. But it's a vibrant, strong, I mean, it's the only one in that whole area, obviously. And it's messy for a bunch of reasons. It's messy because they've got things, and I'm not saying this is a bad thing. It's messy because they have things like proportional representation, which guarantees perpetual minority governments and coalitions that have to, you know, race around and coordinate and cooperate and so on. Is that a bad thing? No, that's not a bad thing. Is it a good thing? Well, it can be. It can also be difficult to have, you know, sustained, stable government. You know, and I talk to Americans, and they, and many of you do too, and they look at us and say, I've had many of them say to me, God, I wish we had your system. You know, it's messy, but we can actually get things done. In the States, and I think we all pay attention to what goes on down there to an extent, you know, you've got this going on all the time. It's virtually gridlock all the time. And it's very difficult to get anything done down there. And we've evolved. You know, from 1867 to the Statute of Westminster in 1931, to Baker's Bill of Rights in 60, to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in 82, and maybe the Reform Act in 2014. I don't know. The next evolution, I hope, will be the Senate. I don't know if we've talked about that yet today. You know, we've been trying to reform that for 8 years with no help from anyone except the province of Alberta. Way to go. You know, we've got to question the Supreme Court on questions of reform or abolition. You know, the elected Senate, you know, a big chunk of people in this room are old reformers, and I'm an old reformer. And, you know, I'm becoming more concerned about the concept of elected Senate, because we're not just going to have liberals and conservatives. We're going to have Greens and Dippers and Bloc and Independents, and this could be a mishmash. And I'm a little concerned that we may be sitting, and if they're elected, they're going to want real power, obviously. And I'm a little concerned that we may be setting ourselves up for something like, you know, House of Representatives and the Senate in the U.S. So you know, we need to think this all the way through. And I throw out a suggestion that you know, people much smarter than this than me, like John Williams out there, is the House of Lords model, or what I understand the House of Lords model to be in the UK. And that's, you know, taking people who have had distinguished careers in whatever, and who don't need the job is the important thing, and putting them there for 8 years. Let it be truly a house of sober second thought. Don't pay them a salary or benefits. Pay them a decent per diem when they're actually doing something. And don't let them interfere with legislation. But let them be truly a house of sober second thought and an advisor to whichever government. I mean, Trudeau made a move the other day, which the Prime Minister summarizes by saying, you know, instead of unelected Liberal senators, we will have unelected senators who are Liberals. I don't think there's going to be much difference. So those kind of discussions, like the future of the Senate, the Reform Act, maybe proportional representation should be healthy debates that we should not be afraid to have. Just like we should not be afraid to debate other difficult issues that we're afraid to talk about. Democracy doesn't work for everybody all the time. That's where leadership comes in. Leaders have to lead. Leaders have to make decisions. Sometimes, and I don't agree with everything we do, I don't agree with everything the Prime Minister does. There's a difference between agreeing with and supporting. I'll air my disagreements in, as I've done with him personally. I'll air them in caucus. But when the door's open, unless it's something so fundamental that I just can't live with it, then I will support it because I am part of that team. I don't have to like it all the time, I don't have to agree with it all the time, but we are part of a team. And that doesn't mean Canada's democracy is broken, because we are still the envy of the rest of the world. We will continue to evolve, but it's up to us in this room and all Canadians to ensure that evolution continues, and that we all have a say in the outcome. And to me, that's democracy, and our democracy needs work. It will always need work, but that's democracy, and on balance, we're just fine. Thank you.